And I hope you have in your head this idea that in the 18th century we had these extraordinary formalisms that explain a great deal of how the physical world worked, but they were not enough. And that somehow we needed new principles to understand the world that we live in. So I like to say that complexity science stands in relation to the Industrial Revolution as mathematical physics does to the scientific revolution of the 17th century. So this is the period in which machines were being made to substitute for human labor. And out of those machines came the science that we now call thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. The problem with an engine is it has to be regulated. You know, you have to start and stop, and you have to move at a certain speed. So James Watt took a machine that had been invented by Christian Huygens to regulate the rotational angular velocity of a windmill blade and used them to regulate the speed of an engine. This is the so-called Watt centrifugal governor. To regulate the supply of steam, when the valve is parallel to the outside of the ring, it shuts the opening nearly perfectly, but when its plane lies at an angle to the ring, it emits more or less steam according to the degree it is opened. Consequently, the piston is acted upon with more or less force. Thermodynamics, statistical mechanics, and mechanisms of control. This device is the first cybernetic machine that was ever made, a system of feedback control. So this is the Beagle. This is a very important boat because Darwin was on it. Darwin lived here. He lived in a space of about 10 feet by 10 feet with 2 other men for 5 years. When he was on that boat, Fitzroy, the captain, was very religious but very well read, and he made sure that there was a very well-stocked library on the Beagle. In fact, Darwin's room was not only shared with a mast and 2 other men, but with the library. And in that library was a book by Charles Lyell, The Principles of Geology. This is the book that says that the Earth is dynamic and it's changing slowly under the action of natural forces. When he got back from the Beagle voyage, he read this book, Malthus's Principles of Population. In this book, Malthus points out that populations grow exponentially, but resources grow linearly. And the consequence of that is that we're always scrabbling for finite resources. And through competition, we kill each other. And so either a population collapses, or in Darwin's case, it's tuned to be adaptive. Anyway, that's Downhouse. That's where Darwin lived, once he got back. And he's read Lyell, he's read Malthus, he's come up with the idea of natural selection. What does he do? He procrastinates for 22 years. And he spends 8 years writing a book on barnacles. So we get to 1858, he's writing his barnacle book, and he gets a letter. This is a very famous letter. It's a letter from this man, Alfred Russel Wallace, who sends him a letter from Ternate, an island in Indonesia, where he says he's got this new idea which is essentially natural selection. And Darwin throws a wobbly. And he says, oh my God, I've been scooped. I knew about this 22 years ago. Why didn't I publish? So they jointly publish, and neither of them turn up. Alfred Russel Wallace has a perfectly good excuse. He's around the other side of the world, and Charles Darwin is just a misanthrope. And so he doesn't present it. It's presented by actually Charles Lyell and Hooker. And what metaphor do they use to explain natural selection? We have also here an acting cause or principle to account for that balance so often observed in nature. The action of this principle is exactly like that of the centrifugal governor of the steam engine. So the original mechanism that Darwin and Wallace used to explain natural selection to the world was the James Watt cybernetic feedback controller of steam engines. Now, when Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, he took that out and he replaced the governor with gravity. He thought, the governor's this little widget. It doesn't feel like a universal principle. I need to put something more grand in its place. and he put gravity in its place, which is completely pointless. It doesn't work at all, and he says as much. It has been said that I speak of natural selection as an active power deity, but who objects to an author speaking of the attraction of gravity as ruling the movements of the planets? Everyone knows this is meant as a metaphor, and blah, blah, blah. It was a terrible metaphor. In fact, interestingly, the same year of the publication of Origin of Species, James Clerk Maxwell publishes this paper on the nonlinear dynamics of the stability of Saturn's rings. Okay? It's a very important paper. It's actually a very interesting concept. We now have more advanced concepts to explain the stability of the rings. But even Maxwell realized, well, that's not such an interesting thing. What I really should be working on is governors. And so James Clerk Maxwell did the reverse. Darwin gave up on this mechanical idea in place of gravity, and Maxwell, who knew gravity much better than Darwin, moved towards the study of machines. The great historian or critic, commentator on machines in the 19th century was Charles Babbage. And he traveled all over Britain interviewing designers, industrialists, engineers to determine how they made their machines. And he says, the object of the present volume is to point out the effects and the advantages arise from the use of tools and machines, and to trace both the causes and the consequences of applying machinery to supersede the skill and power of the human arm. But what Babbage really wanted to do was to supersede the skill and power of the human mind. He wanted to build a different kind of machine, a machine that we would now call a computer. And in 1840, he went to Turin, where we just were, to actually see Babbage's papers. And he presented a series of lectures on what he called the analytical engine, which was the first real concept of a general-purpose computer. And this is one of his absolutely beautiful diagrams for one of the cogs in the analytical engine. He gave the lecture. It was transcribed by an Italian mathematician, Luigi Manabrea, into French. And Ada Lovelace, Lord Byron's daughter, who was a friend of Charles Babbage, translated it into English. And she added an appendix to her translation, which is here, which is the first computer program. It's actually a computer program for the computation of the Bernoulli sequence, the Bernoulli numbers. Kind of an amazing thing. She actually went on to explain that actually the real value of computers in the future would be to be composers. So she was completely visionary.